Good morning from Denver, Colorado, and happy local time across the world. Thank you all for joining us for week 3 of the Global Classroom. This week, we're very fortunate to have with us the woman known as the mother of the SDGs, and she's going to share her story with us and then leave ample time for Q&A. So please make sure you have your questions in on the Slido and that you vote up the questions you're most interested in hearing. So today we have with us Ms. Paula Caballero. Paula is the Nature Conservancy's Regional Managing Director for Latin America. In this role, she leads a team of more than 400 staff across 9 countries, stretching from Mexico to Argentina, to deliver bold new strategies and partnerships to conserve the world's most biodiverse region. Caballero has extensive experience in sustainable development. She is recognized as having created the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals concept, which is considered to be a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. And for this work, she received the German Sustainability Award in 2019 and the Zayed International Prize for the Environment in 2014 for her contribution to environmental action leading to positive change. And I'll stick with the short bio for today so we can get right into Paula's story. So Paula, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's quite a pleasure to have such an international and diverse group. And I'm going to be very transparent and tell you why I always welcome being invited to a group such as this to share the story. And that is because we really are at a planetary inflection point. The safe space that as humans we have inhabited for the last 12, 15,000 years that have really enabled the inexorable rise, if you will, of our global civilization is very much under threat. And the SDGs were a recognition of that and an attempt to find a very ambitious and bold and transformative framework that would enable us to collectively and individually tackle the many fronts that are needed, the synergistic, interrelated fronts that are needed to address this global crisis. Let me just say that when I started out, one of the main reasons why I was laughed out of rooms and thought that everybody thought what I was proposing was absolutely ridiculous is because it was a paradigm shift, and I'll go into that. But above all, it was because we had this baked-in idea of development, and that what was good was to continue to replicate a Western model of development, of economic growth, that had delivered a division between developed and developing nations. And the way the world was structured back then was that the onus for implementation was with developing countries. And so we had a structure like the Millennium Development Goals or the MDGs, which very simply predicated that the global South, we were then called third and fourth type of countries, third world and fourth world countries, that we were the ones that had a problem and that we had to sort it out. And the role of the global North or developed countries, First Nations, if you will, or primary countries, was that it would be transfer of technology or transfer of resources or capacity building. And that actually never came to pass. I mean, it has come to pass, but with enormous shortfalls and difficulties all along the ways. And the issue of finance is always first and foremost in all of the COPs that I have ever attended. And full disclosure, I was a COP1 of climate change. I can give you an idea of how many COPs I've been to. Thankfully, not all of them. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be sane talking to you today. But I've been to a lot of COPs, and the issue of finance comes up. But that was the world. Developing, first world, second world, third world, fourth world, and a very clear division of duties and a sense of what could look like. And so the MDGs baked that in. It was very much a divided world. It was a world where you had 2 types of countries and a very clear roadmap of what was needed. When we came along and proposed the SDGs, and I say we because it really took a village, and even within my government, if I had not had the support, for example, of my vice minister, Patti Londoño, from the word go, the SDGs would have simply never seen the light of day. And so that ability to put forward this real paradigm shift was very much predicated on the unconditional support I had from Patti, then from the minister, Maria Angela Holguín, and ultimately from the president, Juan Manuel Santos. And then as you will see in my conversation today, and as you can read in the book that Patti and I wrote, it really took a village. It took a lot of people to bring this together. So I've mentioned the fact that this was a very contentious subject, and let me dig into why it was. Because as I say, the reason I'm here today is because I want you to really understand how hard it was to get the SDGs to become a reality, so that now you are called upon, and I call upon every single one of you in whatever walks of life you have, to be as transformative as the SDGs were and to be able to implement them in a transformative way. Because if we continue with the business as usual, we really are not on a good pathway in any way. So these were truly not an organic outgrowth of the UN, as many believe. When I joined government, the Colombian government, towards the end of 2010, I'd been out of government for 15 years. I knew nobody. I'd been out of the negotiations, et cetera, et cetera. What I was told was the agenda for this upcoming thing, Rio Plus 20, was really very uninspiring. It was something that really made very little sense to anybody outside of the UN or all these negotiating tracks. It didn't make sense to a local mayor, to a corporate, to a local business or owner. It didn't make sense to civil society, and it didn't make sense to scientists. There was no space for action. And I thought, really, we're going to have this huge gathering at the level of heads of states at a moment where we are already in an inflection point, because back then I already saw what was going to be happening now, and it's all played out. And how can we possibly waste this enormous opportunity? And so that's when I convened just a group of colleagues from across government, people that I thought were very bright. There really was no prescription in terms of who was coming from what agency. And we started to brainstorm. And the long story is that's where I said, okay, I have this idea. Let's build on the MDGs, which were good. The MDGs were really important. They transformed global development. They created a metric. The Gates Foundation leaned into Gavi, the Global Vaccination Initiative. That took off. There was all this really great movement around the MDGs, but I thought they were completely insufficient. It was a very narrow social agenda, and it had lovely things like end poverty and end hunger. And you don't end poverty and end hunger by wishing that or through a minimalist agenda. You end hunger by transforming global food systems. And that's working with smallholders, securing short and long value chains. I mean, it's very complex, this bit about ending hunger or ending poverty. But that wasn't understood at the time. So when we put forward this idea, we were, as I was saying, laughed out of the room. Everybody thought it was the most ridiculous and ludicrous idea possible because of the following. One was in it, we were calling for an integrated agenda that covered the whole of development. And we were told, and this is actually true, that the MDGs were great because they could be put into kitchen magnets and they were like really nice and concise. So why in the world was I coming up with this absolutely crazy, wholesome idea? It was undoable. Second idea that was very complicated was that I kept arguing that it had to be integrated, that individual targets would not matter, that you had to have, that the important thing was to mix and to understand the synergies and the trade-offs between them. I used to talk about, I don't know how many endless PowerPoint presentations I put together trying to sell this idea. And I used to call them the gray armies. A water goal with water targets that are about water, and some agency will, well, no, water is cross-cutting. It has to be a whole of society, a whole of ecosystem, a whole of government approaches. And that did not sit well. So this idea of having a complete and comprehensive integrated agenda was seen as completely impractical and unimplementable, and was ascribed to the fact that I was somebody who had no idea what I was talking about. A lot of people also thought I was a rogue operator that didn't really have the support of my government. So, and I can come back to that. So the other reason why it was seen as absolutely unworkable is because it was a universal agenda. And so I would have a lot of people come to me from both developed and developing countries and tell me what an absurd, stupid idea this was, because obviously developed countries had sorted out all their development issues. And what in the world would they have to say? And why should we hold them accountable for this, which was clearly a problem of third world, fourth world countries not of countries that were already developed. Like, what would we talk about? That actually surfaced a problem we face later on. Nobody really knows how to talk or knew how to talk about development in the context of developed countries. We can point to what's wrong with Botswana or Colombia, but it was very hard to say what was wrong with Belgium or France. And so there was this myopic view that they had, developed countries had sorted it all out, and developed countries were the ones that sort of had to, not sort of, that had to tackle all these development issues. So that was this idea of a universal agenda was very much rejected. But there was also a very strong bias behind it, which came out in this phrase that I heard so often, why Colombia? And the question there was, why is Colombia proposing a global agenda? And I would get asked all the time, why Colombia? And explicitly, you do realize that you are proposing a global agenda in the most patronizing tones possible, as if only, developed countries could possibly propose a global agenda. And here was this little Colombian who had sort of stumbled into a proposal, and she had to be righted, and it had to be clear what it was that she was proposing. And to which, obviously, I said, yes, of course, we know that. This is what we're advocating for. So this idea of a universal agenda was difficult, but it was also the fact that an agenda like this probably could have only come from a developing country. Because if a developed country, say Switzerland, had proposed this, it would have been seen as having all sorts of hidden conditionalities, and it would not have carried the day. As it was, Colombia was very completely accused all the time of not being able, of not understanding the implications of this agenda. And there was wholesale rejection in the G77. I trust everybody here is familiar with the negotiation bodies in the UN. The G77 is the body that encompasses all of the developing countries. The G77, it was wholesale rejection of the SDGs because, well, for many reasons, but some of them thought, oh, great, you got an overview. That's very helpful. Many people thought that Colombia was nuts, and what we were doing was setting up the developing world with even more conditionalities that would sidetrack the MDGs. So there was also this other issue, which was really big, which was what I ended up calling MDG plus. So we're seeing that it was rejected because it was universal. We were seeing it was rejected because it was comprehensive, rejected because it called for an integration across all sectors. But it was very much also rejected because of the MDGs. So one of the things I used to call, and this is really a cautionary tale for all of you, was what I used to call MDG plus. And that was a sense that there were two tracks in the UN, the one that came from the Monterey Consensus, et cetera, the development track that was in the hands of the development practitioners, USAID at that point, DFID, all of the bilateral development agencies. The development community ran that with economists. That was their purview. There's another purview called the Earth Summit in that track, and there had been Joburg plus 10, and now there was going to be Rio plus 20. And these two tracks were completely separate. They could not meet. And so the expectation, this being early 2011, was that the MDGs had 4 years to run, and nobody could interject themselves in their process. And they were not doing that great. It was very lumpy, but the whole of humanity had committed to the MDGs, and they had to be allowed to round their course without anybody touching them, least of all somebody from another track. And so when I proposed that we do the SDGs, I was breaking a lot of really strong rules, the explicit and implicit in all of these negotiations and in the UN system, which was the MDGs have 4 years to run, and eventually those constituencies that are in charge of the MDGs will figure out what happens post-2015, not now, and they're separate. I ignored that. And I think part of the reason that we were able to make the SDGs happen was because I did a process of what I could call informal diplomacy. I didn't go through the usual channels. The SDGs would have never seen the light of day. I went through other channels that I can describe. But the point is that the MDG constituency was up in arms when they started to see the SDGs gaining traction. And that was probably one of the key sources of opposition to the SDGs. And the story there was, how dare you propose an alternative to the MDGs? They have 4 years to run. You don't care about poverty. You don't care about hunger. you're an evil person, Colombia is out of whack, et cetera, et cetera. The MDGs are untouchable. So there was a lot of reasons, as you can see now, why the SDGs could never have seen the light of day. Everything was arraigned against them, just everything. And yet we prevailed. And the story of how we prevailed is in a book that I wrote with Patty. It's called Redefining Development. And I'm happy to say I have to send you the link marker. Maybe somebody can Google it up right now as we talk. Lynn Reiner Publishers. And if you go there, and I should have done this before, but if you click on Redefining Development, it's open access now. Negotiations, the publisher carried out negotiations, and it's been supported. So now there's open access for the book. So if you want to read the full details, all the gory details of what that negotiation was like, it's in that book. What's really important about, thank you, Mark, about that book also is that it had annexes. And for the first time, you see a lot of what are called conference room papers, which are the papers that are just churned out whenever you walk into a negotiation room with the very latest. Those CRPs are the ones that relate to the SDGs are in the annex. So you actually get to see what a lot of these documents look like. Some of these documents also shed light on the role of the Secretariat, the role of the presidency. I think it's a really amazing trove of documents. So that's in the annexes of the book. But in the book, we describe in a lot more detail the whole story of what this was like. And it was a wild ride. What I would like to highlight is why I think that we prevailed. One, as I said, is that it was built from the bottom up. I did not try it. There was a UN resolution, and these are carved in stone and immutable, that defined the agenda for Rio Plus 20. And I was told from the very first, you cannot change the agenda for Rio. It's set. Like, this is a stupid idea, and you can't change the agenda. So if I had tried to change the agenda through a formal process of renegotiating, it would have never seen the light of day. I built it bottom up. I actually, in a way, operated like an NGO within the UN, being a part of a government that was completely backing me up. It was a very unique situation. And what I did is that I very gradually built up a cohort of people who believed in the SDGs. But I did this one-on-one. It wasn't like wholesale, come to this event and people walk out and they're converted. It was one-on-one meetings, one-on-one in this thing called the Vienna Cafe. And I would pull people in there. And then I started to get a few people that believed in me, and they would pull people in there. And we started to gain momentum. The very first meeting in the history of humanity, of the SDGs, if you will, was on the 27th of May. And I have the prototype of the notes I took from that meeting in the book. But by then, I already had a pretty good sense of what the negotiation lines were, where the divisions were. And it was things like CBDR. Does everybody know what CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities, is that something that's been covered? Okay, that comes from the I'm trying not to use acronyms, the Convention on Climate Change. And basically in the framework of that convention, what it says is that there are common responsibilities to tackle climate change, but differentiated responsibilities. So they're common, but they're differentiated because the countries that have the big historical footprint are more responsible to tackle this than developing countries that have not had that historical imprint. That we could talk about 3 hours about that. It's become an acronym, CBDR, and it is actually one of the biggest stumbling blocks in all the multilateral environmental negotiations and other negotiations. But suffice it to say that there was CBDR came up, it was like developed countries have to do more than developing countries, which in a way was nonsensical because we were predicating a universal agenda. There were concerns over the MDGs, there were concerns over conditions, all of the stuff I've talked about, that came up very quickly. But I was not dissuaded. And in July, there was a big meeting in Indonesia on one of the two tracks of the formal tracks of Rio Plus 20. And I asked for permission to present the SDGs, and I was sort of like, yeah, present them. So I presented them. There was never a conversation. I was given the floor. I presented the SDGs, and that was the end of the story. Because there was a whole conversation around global goals, because at that point, Ban Ki-moon was launching something called Sustainable Energy for All, which was about energy access and a very progressive energy agenda. And these were also global goals. So the two things got confused, and a lot of people didn't even understand what I was talking about, which was completely different. And I explained that in the book. Then in August, Brazil had as presidency, as host of Rio Plus 20, they had two informal gatherings or consultations. One of them was in August of 2011. And at that meeting, I presented the SDGs. What I had at that point was a very simple, well, it wasn't very simple, but it was a document that demonstrated how it was building on the agenda of on Agenda 21, which is a big document that came out, a blueprint for development that came out of Rio Plus 20. And so Agenda 21, I was told I had to show that I was part of that legacy. So it's all about Agenda 21 and, you know, how different themes or different issues could be rewritten. And what I saw sitting there in that, it was a 2-day meeting, when I sat there sitting there, was that we were getting sidetracked with the whole story of Agenda 21 and that I needed to really focus on these negotiations. So I went home to the hotel that night, rewrote it up. And by that point, Guatemala, I'm skipping over a whole lot of stuff, but you can read it in the book. At that point, Guatemala had said that they wanted to join. So I said to Guatemala, I'm going to rewrite this thing tonight. Are you in? And they confirmed that they were in. I got it cleared with my vice minister. And the next, I had asked for Brazil for permission to present the SDGs, and they had said it's an informal consultation. Anybody can present anything. So I said, okay. So I presented the SDGs story. And then the next day, I went in with my little USB, printed it out, distributed. And that was really the conversation of the 2 days was around the SDGs. We talked about other things, but what grabbed everybody's attention was that. And so that sort of famous first paper, or seen as the first paper, the Colombia-Guatemala proposal, that's what that was that I wrote in that hotel, the room that night. And that was really where the SDGs started to make even more inroads with that document. But it was interesting because countries that will go unnamed were really supportive of that proposal, like really supportive. They thought it was great. And then about 2 weeks later, we had the ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America, had a regional meeting on Rio Plus 20. And Alicia Bárcenas, who's today's Secretary of Environment of Mexico at the time, was the executive director of ECLAC, and just a brilliant, amazing woman. And she immediately was captivated with the SDG. She was a really strong supporter. So I sent a formal, as Colombia, we sent in a formal conference document that was circulated. And what ended up happening was that some people from those same governments were adamantly against the proposal, in part because why wasn't there a proposal from X country and only a proposal from Colombia? It was like, well, if you have a proposal, propose it. But they didn't have anything, but they were just upset that Colombia had one. And the reason I'm saying this is because I ended up negotiating the SDGs not with 193 countries. I negotiated them with 700 or 800, I don't know how many delegates. There was such stark divisions within countries. Some thought it was great, like usually ministries of foreign affairs were interested, ministries of environment, ministries of development that dealt with development issues, adamantly opposed. And so there were these stark divisions within countries. And there were all these reasons that played into it that had nothing to do with the actual negotiations. So after that, what happened in parallel, and this is where that bottom-up really came to play, there was a meeting organized by civil society in Germany. 1,300 organizations participated. And Felix Dodds, who was the organizer with the stakeholder forum, was absolutely gung-ho on the SDGs. And this conference adopted and endorsed the SDG concept. They wholesale. So immediately it got disseminated around the world, and there was this buildup from civil society of the intensity and the eagerness around this idea. Private sector started to come to me and say, this is incredible. Something's going to come out of the UN that makes sense for us, that we can build our businesses around, that we can use our metrics, our ESG, our CSR, whatever you have, we can do it around this. So there started to be all of this momentum. Long story short, it had already been determined by the greater powers of the Secretariat for the UNCSD. UNCSD is the formal acronym for Rio Plus 20. But Rio Plus 20 Secretariat, if you will, that the 1st of November was limit the deadline for everybody to propose, and everybody's everybody, governments and all the constituencies, what in the UN is called the major stakeholder groups. Everybody could propose what they wanted to see in what was called the zero draft. That is the draft that was the basis for the negotiations for Rio Plus 20, what we would take to go to heads of state in Rio. And that's where I had been told, over your dead body, there's no way you can get the SDGs in. Well, the story that 1st of November was that we were glued to the computer, all of my team, watching the submissions come in and in constant touch with the secretariat. And finally, around 2 p.m, the secretariat said to me, breathe, it's okay, the SDGs are in. And just think about that. 10 months before, or less, 9 months before we had started to try to put this in January. This was, well, actually 11 months. This was November. And they were this crazy idea that had been repudiated by so many people was already a part of.
Fell down in hold up in Abuja. Hold up.
Could you please? Thank you. Was already part of the zero draft. So that was a game changer. November 1st was a game changer. And within the annex of the book was actually the tally that the secretariat was taking. It wasn't that the SDGs were in like they told us. It was that the SDGs had, I don't know when you call it in bowling, when you throw the ball and all the pins fly off into the air. That's what we had done with the SDGs. The SDGs were the concept that had the most traction by far of any of the other, even things like green economy that were formerly a part of the Rio Plus 20 negotiations, got less recommendations for inclusion than the SDGs. The SDGs were like, we knocked it out of the park, but we didn't know that. I didn't know that. So we were still on tenterhooks trying to make this happen. Story is that on the 4th of November, with the support of the Netherlands and Norway, we held a consultation in Bogota because I had told my vice minister, but we've got to do like a real, like what I did in May, but like a real consultation. So we pulled together and we had 24 people. I remember there were about 14 governments. Somebody was even sent from the UN Secretary General's office. People were starting to like pay attention to us. We sat them around the table and it was a real consultation on the SDGs in Colombia, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. What was interesting was at the end of that meeting, I pulled together people, not delegates. I mean, I was always working, trying to find who could be my champions. I pulled together people and I asked them I said, we have to create like the secret friends of the SDGs. Otherwise, this is never going to see the light of day. And we stuck together for many years, the secret friends of the SDGs, and more people came. It wasn't secret in the sense that it wasn't transparent. Everybody knew we were meeting, but it was just that we met on the sides, we were a group of catharsis of, okay, this is what I'm hearing. There's this concern, there's this language coming up. What do we do? And so we helped. That was the start of this group. In December, the secretariat, the UN had convened a very big meeting to sort of launch the start to tell people, okay, this is where we are. This is what Rio Plus 20 is going to look like. The zero draft wasn't out yet. They were trying to compile that. That came out in January. This was the last meeting before that. And we had decided that Colombia was going to host a side event on the SDGs. Let me just say it was amazing. We convened, we had no idea who would come, but we convened just in case, a really big conference room. And there were 114 countries in that room. And we know that because I got somebody from the embassy from our mission to count the number of countries. And there was just this buzz that was starting around the SDGs. But buzz is good and bad. And in this case, it was also very bad because everybody who was opposed to the SDGs were like, what is this? So in January, we started with the formal negotiations. In February, actually, the beginning of February, I convened. It was crazy. After that big side event in December, I decided we needed to have an even bigger consultation like we'd had in Bogota. And again, very generous developed country partners stepped in and helped us to pay. Colombia had no funding at all for this. And we had this huge gathering at Tarrytown. And I called them, these were all Chatham House in the sense that it wasn't attributable. But I asked for permission to have like chairman's insight so that I could gather what had been discussed and put it out there because I needed people to understand what the conversation was about. I sat 80 people around the room. I was told I couldn't do it, and I did because I wanted everybody to see each other. So I chaired a meeting with 80 people, and it was amazing. And what was really important was, especially for everybody who was opposed to the SDGs, I wanted to hear them. I wanted to draw them out because I could have a sensible conversation if they understood why they hated the SDGs. But if it was a knee-jerk reaction, I couldn't. Lesson 1. If you're trying to be transformative and to really break into new paradigms, talk to everybody who's opposed to them. Help them craft their reasoning against you. Don't try to convince them. Help them understand why they are against you. And then you can talk to them and work with them. And this is exactly what we did. So the negotiation started. Let me just say that I think the original zero draft was 19 pages. It spiraled into, I don't know, one point I think it was 400 pages. You'll see it in the annexes. I mean, there were entire paragraphs that were like, not all paragraphs were in brackets, but on top of that, there were variations on the paragraphs, on the structure of the document. And the SDGs in the original version, I think, were like 5 paragraphs. The rest of it was that we were renegotiating all of the big issues around reproductive rights, around energy, around ocean, you name it, there was a track. There were, I think, 27 tracks. And that's what everybody was focused on, was renegotiating all this language. So the SDGs were really marginal, and we were given very little time to work and to negotiate them. So we started off with these negotiations. The first thing the G77 did was rewrite the entire thing and submit their own version. That's how it started off. So it was very auspicious. The SDGs got killed from the word go, basically, and it was all MDGs. And that's what I was up against. And since Colombia's part of the G77, the way that works is that I couldn't negotiate. I could only negotiate within the G77, who names a coordinator, a facilitator, or a chair, or a coordinator, whatever the name is, who negotiates on behalf of the G77. It is very unwieldy. You can imagine what this looks like in the climate change negotiations, where you have Barbados, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, and Colombia. I mean, it's quite complicated. But here it was equally complicated. And to make matters worse, the person who was designated to be the coordinator was none other than Farouk Khan, whom I knew very, very well from the climate change negotiations. Farouk is a brilliant, seasoned negotiator, and he hated the SDGs, and I knew that. And I thought, oh my gosh, I really was like, I just wanted to die. Long story short, Farouk, as I said, is very brilliant and very rapidly came to understand that we were not just revamping the MDGs, and this was not a waste of time. He saw very rapidly what the SDGs were about and flipped. If I'm called the mother of the SDGs, Farouk is the father of the SDGs. But it was a balancing act to the bitter end. And some of the most bitter conversations in G77 were against Farouk, because he believed in the SDGs, but he was representing the interests of the G77. And we could not have been more far apart. I even broke protocol at one point and made a submission as Colombia against it, in addition to the G77. In the negotiations, that's like, there's a no-no, and then there's things you really don't do. That's something you do not do. That's how desperate I was. It was awful. It was perfectly, perfectly awful. But through it all, we did side events, consultations, tried to get people around. And one of the most decisive moments was after a particularly horrible session. I would fly from Bogota to New York like a little yo-yo. It was, my carbon footprint was bad, but hopefully it was for a greater good of everything else. I came to my vice minister. I said, it's going so badly in the G77. It is going so badly. And she said, well, let's analyze. So we analyzed it and came to the conclusion that we needed to get the basic. I don't know if have you done basic Brazil? Okay, it's another informal negotiation. It includes the big developing countries, India, China, South Africa, Brazil. And we analyzed and we thought Brazil is going to want to carry the day. And we went through it, right? And China is always supportive, or usually will not have an issue with metrics if they don't see that there's conditionalities. There were a lot of analysis, deep analysis that we did to try to figure out where a stumbling block that we could talk with was, and came to the conclusion it was India. And so Bati said to me, okay, we're going to Delhi. And off we went to Delhi. We met with everybody who was relevant to this negotiation in Delhi and had really amazing conversations. The Indian diplomatic service is world class, and they understood all the issues. And once they understood that Colombia wasn't trying to and wasn't going to sort of shoot developing countries in the foot or in the liver, and that there was not all these hidden conditionalities, that this was actually an agenda that was good, that tackled global public goods, et cetera, they were all in. And a few months later, there was, or about a month later, a particularly acrimonious meeting in the G77, where, all the time I was like, okay, this is lost. We've lost the battle. This is it. We can't go on. There was one of those, there was all the time, and one of those moments. And Vivek from the Indian delegation spoke up and said, on such and such, he had all the documents, on such and such a date, we agreed to this, we did this. It is a cardinal principle, unspoken principle, that if there's agreement amongst us as colleagues, we do not backtrack. And he gave this incredibly beautiful, eloquent speech. And the person from this other country that out of the blue had blocked everything shut up. And he carried the day. And when I came up to him, I said, and this story's in the book, I said, Vivek, you saved the day. And he said, India told Colombia that we would support you and we don't go back on our word. So there were all these really amazing moments in the middle of all of this incredible complexity. But in my last minutes, what I really want to underscore is not just the importance of the SDGs. Probably the most important, or it's hard to say which is most important, but equally important, were the format that we defined to negotiate. Let me explain. I mentioned how we had spiraled from 9 pages to 400 pages, everything in brackets. Brackets means it's not agreed. All of this is explained in the annex of the book, like how things are negotiated at the UN. Brackets means it's like on hold, we don't agree. The reason for that was because of the format. You would go into these rooms, there was a huge screens, they would put the text up and people would edit online. So New Zealand would put in a comment, and then Ireland would put in a comment, then Bolivia would put in something, and the secretary just wrote it all down, and it was impossible to navigate or to understand, and everything was open. And I thought, if we do this, we're going to end up with a political declaration, not a metric. We need statisticians in the room. We need people to understand they have to. An indicator is something to make it worthwhile. You have to be able to measure it. Measuring costs a lot of money, and then it has to influence investments and policy frameworks, etc. This is serious stuff. It's not just another declaration coming out of the UN. So we needed the right kind of format. So very early on, we saw that otherwise after Rio, we would have this concept, SDGs could become anything, and nothing would come of it. So we were adamant that we had to create the right format, and we created what became the Open Working Group. There's been loads of books written about that. The two co-chairs did a brilliant job managing it. That's where the actual framework of the SDGs was negotiated. But it was Colombia with groups of friends that got that to happen. And the most bitter fights down to the line in Rio was over the Open Working Group, because as we were asking that we have a technocratic open, which meant for us that it would be webcast, everybody could sit in the room. It wasn't a closed thing. Open, but not open-ended. It wasn't like everybody could just sit there and negotiate. It was not a negotiating group, not negotiating. It was a technical group that was going to come up with a framework, with something that looked and smelled, as I put it, as a metric, with clear targets and goals and targets and indicators. And that had really not happened that way, because the MDGs were, in a way, pulled out of the hat within the UNDP offices and presented to the world. This was going to be a negotiation, open, whereby the entire world needed to participate. And so even some of the secret friends of the SDGs who were supportive of this thought that this was the most stupid idea and were terrified. And so what people wanted was a high-level panel run by the Secretary General, which was the standard format when you really wanted to deal with contentious issues or difficult issues. Convene a panel of experts, they meet behind closed doors and eventually issue a report. I didn't want that. Or the alternative of what we were living in, these horrible, ghastly negotiations, which were just so time-consuming. So everybody was pretty much against that. One of the key reasons why we had the Open Working Group was Mexico. Unfortunately, he passed away, but Damaso Luna of Mexico was an amazing negotiator. And Mexico had the great thing that they are not part of the G77 or any of the formal negotiating groups. So he could speak freely whenever he wanted to. And he gave the most impassioned battles for this Open Working Group. Every time, but we would put that, and then they would consolidate the draft, and this idea would come out. It wasn't until Rio, and again, there's a whole chapter on this, so you can see how complicated it was. I can't go into the details, but suffice it to say that with Farouk, and I really hand it again, Farouk, the reason we have SDGs is Farouk. Selwyn Hart, who works with the Secretary General on climate today. He's from Barbados. It's a group of us that knew each other from all these other negotiations, and the Brazilian presidency, that at the end and again, this is a very unique document that's in the annex, where you can actually see the layout of the state of play of the negotiations on like the 15th of June. The Brazilians had said that everything had to be decided by the 18th because they were not going to bring open text to heads of delegation, which is what everybody had been counting on, like to the bitter last minute. I mean, if you've seen the followed the climate change negotiations, they always go 3 days after, and then they get cobbled together. Brazil has said this is not going to happen on our watch. So we were under an incredible timeline. And when this option was put to Brazil, they chose it. So it took a lot of political courage from a lot of people to make the open working group happen. Let me just say that after Rio, because I always used to say, well, Rio plus 20 is great. What about Rio plus 1? That's another lesson. Always think about what happens afterwards. Right now, everybody's 2030. I'm interested in January 2031. What's going to happen? What are we going to do? Right? And so Rio plus 1, like, what's going to happen? Well, what happened was that it took the UN, well, delegations to the UN 7 months after we decided, after we left Rio, 7 months to decide who would be the 30 countries that would sit in those 30 chairs of the open working group. And it ended up being 60. There's a funny story there that Farouk and I had said, well, we're going to keep it to, because we wrote all these texts, right, that went into the negotiation track. We said, let's put 30, because by the time we finish negotiating this, it's going to be up to 60. So 30, 6 regional groups times 5, that more, okay, 30. But Brazil never really opened that text for negotiation again. So we ended up with 30. But countries finally, there was such a drama around this because everybody wanted to be part of the open working group that countries ended up sharing. So you had 2 or 3 or even 4 seats, 4 governments per seat. So it ended up being 60. But the open working group was revolutionary. And that is something also that we created. So another big lesson is if you want to create a revolution, make sure you have the right format. You can't take new wine and put in old bottles and expect it to do something different. If we hadn't created the open working group, we would not have the SDGs. So in summary, paradigm shifts come with a lot of change and a lot of pain and a lot of problems. And I tell my team at the Nature Conservancy that if the going is really hard, we're doing the right thing. If it's really easy, we're probably part of business as usual. And right now, anybody who's part of business as usual is part of a huge planetary problem. And I'm not talking about environment, socioeconomic. If you think that any of this is environmental, look at what's happening around the world and tell me whether the fires and the droughts and the hurricanes and the desertification and the droughts, that's not environmental, that's socioeconomic. So I leave you with thoughts. Be bold, be audacious, disrupt. We need disruptors. Ask of those that you are trying to change their minds. Help them understand why they are against you and give them all the understanding and then help them understand the alternatives. Create the right kind of vehicles for change. Otherwise, you can have very noble intentions and you're going to remain part of the problem. All of us, every single person on this call, no matter how well-intentioned, is a part of the problem until and unless you disrupt. Remember that. I leave you with a couple of thoughts then. Be disruptive. Never waste a good crisis. We wasted the pandemic. Nothing came of it, but we saw what disruption was like. We're in the middle of at least three crises: climate, biodiversity, and equity. So never waste a good crisis. Think that 2030 is now. There's no until. I have prescribed the word until. It's now, because just as I said, you can't just end hunger. You have to change food systems. That takes a hell of a lot of time in order to change the investments, change the way the banking and the finance sector is structured, change the way the multilateral development banks allocate resources, change the policy frameworks, goad the markets to, it goes on and on. That takes time. 2030 is now. We don't have until 2030 to do anything. And the other big story is that this is an agenda for 2050, not 2030. I pray and talk to whoever will listen to me that we do not, around 2028 or 2029, go, oops, we're not meeting the SDGs. Let's renegotiate them. We are never going to get a framework like the SDGs ever again, as ambitious. If we try, it's like trying to renegotiate Paris. You cannot renegotiate these agreements. And I leave you with a thought. What is sustainability? For me, it's pretty simple. There's at least three capitals: natural capital, economic, and social. And what good looks like is that you have investment policies, whatever, that grow the three capitals. At a minimum, you do not have any investment or policy or action that grows one capital at the expense of the other, which is what we have always done with the environment. Grow, pollute, figure it out later. We're seeing the cost of that globally. So grow the three capitals, be committed to that. So with that, I leave you. I hope that you can, if you're really interested in learning about the process, there's the book, and now it's open access, so you can read all about it there. Thank you for having me, Mark.
Yes, thank you so much for your behind-the-scenes tales of how to be a revolutionary. We hope everybody was taking careful note. And we didn't know that the book was now open access, so we've changed the link on the website so that you can now access the full book in addition to chapter 1, which you were to read before today's presentation. With that, we will turn over to our Q&A, and we'll start here with a question from Madagascar. But Paula, if ever you see another question pop up on the screen that you want to answer, just let me know. Otherwise, we'll go in order of the ones that received the most votes. Jean-Baptiste, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yes. First of all, I thank you for your bright presentation, dear professor. And we also need to move, and we need to change. But we have a little bit problem. So how can we convince our people, the very poor people, if we need to work together, we need collaboration with the poor population, but there is a very big gap between the extremely poor and the rich people. Because of inequality, people don't mind about this sustainable development. So this is my question: how to convince people? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. That's a really good question, Jean-Baptiste. And I have to say that you come from an extraordinarily beautiful country, but one which is exactly facing that. What is the cost of unsustainable development? And Madagascar is facing issues around desertification, is land degradation on a level that is really not viable. And that is going to drive the people that are already in extraordinary poverty into even more extreme poverty. And as I used to say when I was at the World Bank, I was a global director at the World Bank for Environment, I would just say, look, I'm not here about trying to close off or shut down development, because it's always this either or. Either you take care of the poor and deal with growth, so to speak, or you deal with sustainability. I said, my agenda is about keeping development options open, because if you run out of water, if you deplete, for example, all your groundwater, if your land is degraded, you are closing down opportunities that many people would need in order to have dignified lives and a decent livelihood. So all of those farmers, all of those smallholders that are practicing unsustainable practices, they are perpetuating a really bad situation. And so what you need the political will, but oftentimes, and I'm not saying this is the case in Madagascar, you have elite capture. In many countries where you have a small group of people that are benefiting short-term from a given situation, even though it's very clear long-term, this is not going to work out. And so I think that I would reframe the question in terms of how can you ensure that you have the right data points, the right evidence to show that there are alternative development routes possible that are win-win. A lot of those, unfortunately, don't happen overnight because, for example, putting in place more sustainable agricultural ranching practices takes investment and takes time. But I know that if there is a real commitment on the part of government to allocate resources for that, to work in a very much hand in hand with the international community, there is a willingness and a capacity, I would say, to be able to provide support so that these transitions start to happen, for example, in the agriculture and livestock sectors, which is actually where I'm the most focused right now in my work is on ag and ranching. But you have to be able to really evidence that the status quo is going to lead to a progressive devastation from which nobody will benefit. But it is complicated, and it requires a lot of, I would say, collective will and champions. It's a good question. It's really hard. It's just, I would just invite us to reframe it around the definition I gave of sustainability, right? That you don't grow one of these capitals at the expense of the other.
Great. Thank you very much. Amber from Dublin, are you on the line?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Amber from Dublin, UCD. So I have a few questions. So my first one is like, I wonder if we should revise the SDG and to fit like each country's unique needs and challenges, and how we can ensure that achieve the key system indicators that you mentioned in the last year's Global Classroom lecture for the global progress. Yeah.
Well, actually, that's a really good question, Amber. Thank you for asking. But actually, this was a question that came up when we were negotiating the SDGs. And I was told that there's going to be a race to the bottom. And my argument was always, it's not going to be a race to the bottom, because development is a spectrum, and the countries are on a spectrum. Switzerland is going to have very different issues than Chad. But Switzerland has issues. Every country has different issues. And the SDGs is a framework whereby countries will look at what is the most relevant for them. And that's when I was told it was going to be a race for the bottom, and people would just pick and choose whatever was easiest. And that hasn't played out at all. Governments have included, and private sector. This is really important, that this is not just about governments. This makes sense. This resonates with everybody. Everybody from all walks of life uses that little circle of the SDGs, and it's relevant for their planning. It is relevant for them, enabling them to understand where they sit in a development context. And so what was clear from the beginning was that the SDGs were going to be adapted by countries to their particular realities. Take food waste. In most developing countries, a lot of the issue around food waste is at the time of harvest. You need more cold rooms and better management of early on in the food chain. In developed countries, it has to do a lot more at the consumer end, where there's just huge amounts of food get thrown out. So it's the same issue, food waste, but what it feels like is very different. Or you have issues like infant malnutrition. You say, oh, that's a problem only for developing countries. Well, no, there's huge instances of infant malnutrition also in developed countries, where there can be where development can be uneven, where there's things that are situations called food deserts, where it becomes very difficult and expensive for poor people in certain areas to even access healthy food, so forth and so on. So every country, every government, every industry can look at the SDGs and find how they are relevant. And this was actually this was part of the negotiation and part of the discussions. What's important here also is that you start to see that for the SDGs, global public goods were a part of the conversation. Climate, not so much. It's a target goal 13 is very wishy-washy, because remember, this was months before Paris, and we couldn't preempt the negotiations in Paris, which were really complicated. So we had to put in something very anodyne, something very simplistic, that was not part of the actual climate negotiations. But if you look at the SDGs, they look at across all of the issues that are shared across humanity. And I would argue that when you look at global public goods, you're always looking at things like fisheries and areas beyond national jurisdictions, beyond the EEZs. You're looking at atmospheric issues, ozone, climate, etc. But I would argue that there's a lot of equity issues that are also global public goods, in the sense that if you have entire countries where, say, 25% of the population under 5 years old is suffering from malnutrition, those are countries whose human stock, if I can put it that way, I don't know whose population is going to have start out their lives with a lot of barriers, because infant malnutrition, stunting and waste starts to affect the mental acuity, the development capacity of human beings. those first years are absolutely critical. So if you have a huge swath of the world where a huge swath of under 5-year-olds or under 2-year-olds are suffering from infant malnutrition, I say that's a global public good. I say that that is a global issue around equity, because these are countries that are already probably with a lot of development challenges, and they're not going to have the population with the capacity to, or as much capacity to tackle this, because they were not given the privileges of an adequate, nutritious food at the beginning. So there's all of these complexities when you actually start to look at it in a more integrated and holistic way, where what is global progress and what are these key systems? You have to look at it with a much broader and much more ambitious perspective.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question comes from Gary Smith.
Hi, Paula. Thank you so much for a great presentation. I'm also currently pursuing a master's in sustainable development with UCD. Building on your comments, I think there's a real opportunity to achieve the changes that we want and drive systemic change with an infinite mindset. And I'd love to get maybe any thoughts on how we can best engage with the private sector to go beyond the growth at all costs type business model and create an environment where implementing the SDGs is seen as a mutual win-win.
That's a really good question. Look, like I was saying, the SDGs were actually hardly embraced by private sector. They really saw that this was something that could make sense for their ESG, that's environment, social, and governance frameworks, and beyond corporate social responsibility, CSR. So we started out a few decades ago with this idea of corporate social responsibilities that corporations had a social responsibility. And so they would, build schools or help pave a road or what have you. That has evolved to ESGs, the energy, environment, social, and governance frameworks, whereby countries are, I should drink more coffee. Corporations are held to a higher standard where they actually have to have a metric that they report on. So, for example, you have science-based targets whereby companies that subscribe to that agree to keep their the emissions in their productive processes under 1.5. It's more complicated. There's scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. It's complicated depending on those scopes or what you're looking at in the value chain. But basically, companies are now signing on to much more rigorous metrics. They're looking at their emissions, whether they use plastic, how they source their ingredients or their inputs, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of movement already around that. Not enough, but there's a lot of movement. What is really interesting right now, though, is, for example, with the COP16 coming up of the Convention on Biodiversity, CBD, is like Target 15, which calls for much more disclosure and more rigorous disclosure on the part of companies, of corporates. And so what this does is that you have these ESG frameworks, and now you're having requirements.
Looks like we're having some technical difficulties. Let's see if we get Paula back.
Sorry, I got kicked out. I'm not sure what happened. So corporates are really being asked to sign up to much more rigorous metrics and then to disclose them. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, sorry, I muted the wrong person there, but now we got you.
I got kicked out. So corporates are really looking much more to not just having to adopt more rigorous ESG standards, but then to disclose them. And Target 15 under of the Global Biodiversity Framework calls for more rigorous disclosure. You have the Task Force on Climate-related disclosures. You have the Task Force on Nature-related disclosures. You have a lot better understanding. New reports coming out showing that 50% of global GDP, 50% depends on so-called natural assets or natural resources. So there's a growing, you start to see companies that are seeing that cocoa supply chains are being disrupted, coffee supply chains, vanilla supply chains, speaking of our which is something that affects Madagascar, our initial a speaker who asked me a really good question. So I think there's a growing recognition on the fact that there are risks and dependencies across corporate sector that speak to what I always used to say, what environment? I don't care about the environment. There's nothing called environment. There's no such thing as the environment. And the only point I was trying to make is that everything that happens in the so-called environmental sector has implications that are social and economic. So I think that there's really good progress there, Gary. But in the US, there's this interesting backlash against ESG. It's seen as woke. So there's all this, it's been dragged into the political domain. We used to talk about greenwashing. I've now heard talk about green hushing, that companies are doing really good ESG work on ESG frameworks, but are hushing it because they don't want this to be seen to get a backlash. So we're living in really complicated times. Again, we need disruption. We need to think of different ways of approaching this. But no question, private sector, and I would say especially also finance sector, has a huge role to play in shifting financial flows and financial incentives so that we address and can mobilize the kind of patient, long-term transformative capital that is needed for these transformations, for these transitions.
Great, thank you very much. I think you may have addressed Stesha's question about for poorer countries focusing on the economy. Do you have anything to add there? Or should we go to the next question?
I would just say to Stesha that it's how can you secure their earnings? You can't. If you look at a lot of LDCs, less developing countries, for example, they face huge issues around very high debt burden. They have issues around water access or water management. There's issues around land degradation. There's issues around the provision of energy access, of other kinds of access to essential services. So the SDGs are about that. They are about shifting food systems, for example, ensuring that countries have the right kind of technical assistance and resources to put in place more sustainable practices, not just for environmental gains, but so that you can be more productive, so you can get more food out of a hectare than you do actually right now, so that you're looking at universal access to healthcare, access to energy, access to education. That's all part of the SDGs. The SDGs are not, and see what if I can just call it out with all humility, is that there's still implicit in that question this thing of, well, we have to grow now and we deal with sustainability later. And my answer to you is that if we don't embark on a more sustainable pathway, we're not going to be able to deal with the poverty crisis, the equity, the unevenness that there is around the world in terms of access to resources, access to education. You need an integrated agenda, and sustainability is the only way that we're going to be able to create that safe space for all countries and for all peoples.
Great, thank you so much. Laurel, Marks, are you on the line?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Laurel. I'm from Lehigh University, and you had talked about the importance of innovative ideas like the SDGs and different development opportunities. So I was wondering if there was an innovation or product that you've learned about that's being used somewhere in the world that might revolutionize the SDG progress if it was done in more places, and how might that be implemented?
So that's a really good question, and that would be for like another 2-hour conversation. I can think of a lot of things around the changes that are happening in the finance sector, changes that are happening in the ag sector, changes that are happening in the energy transition. So there's a lot of examples, but I leave you with one thought. The most and greatest innovation is individuals, people who really believe in what they need to do and are changing the world. And you have that at all walks of life, whether it's a small entrepreneur or somebody in government or somebody within an NGO. You see around the world so many inspiring stories. And my message to you, all of you, is that individuals matter. If you have a vision, if you have an idea, if you see something and you worked at it, you have to persevere. It's really hard going, but you can change the world. Individuals can change the world.
All right, our next question comes from Rio. João Pedro, are you on the line? All right, let me ask the question on their behalf. How can the state act in locations affected by violence and crime for the effective and integrated implementation of the SDGs? And maybe we add war to that as well.
Well, that's a really, really good question for which I have absolutely no answer. João, you're from Brazil, I'm Colombia. We are looking at very high levels of criminality. One thing that I've been saying for some time now, because both our countries are suffering, especially, for example, in the Amazon from organized crime, is that the problem with organized crime isn't that it's criminal, it's that it's organized. And so I ask the question, where is organized sustainability? And I think that we need to have whole of state responses to the violence, but we need better collaboration, coordination across countries. But we also need to be able to create new opportunities. So to the last question about how, what is the innovation? I think that there is a lot of innovation, for example, around the social bioeconomy. Brazil is very strong on the bioeconomy. And if you look at it from at the Nature Conservancy, we talk about social bioeconomy and sort of looking at shorter value chains also to start to generate opportunities. Because sometimes I'm not saying that this is a silver bullet, and where there's organized crime, there's some very complicated vested interests there. But if you look at some of the people who get caught up in these criminal networks, it is because they do not see other opportunities, particularly youth. So that's why you need a whole of system. Yes, you need to have better monitoring, better enforcement, better understanding of how these criminal chains operate, but you also need to generate opportunity. So it sounds simplistic, but that's why I ask, where's organized sustainability? It's an imperfect answer to a really complicated question.
Thanks. Next, we go to Beijing. Xinghua, do you have a question for us?
Hello, thank you very much, Professor. I'm from Sri Lanka and I'm studying in Tsinghua University. So actually, I want to know, Professor, in my country, it is very hard to achieve sustainable development goals, especially in economic side. So I want to know, is it possible to developing countries to, especially in developing countries, to realistically achieve sustainable development, economic growth with SDG in 2030? 2030 is very near to us now, with the weak government policies on economy. Actually, in my country, there are very lacking, very lacking transparency in tax policies and very weak governmental policies in my country. So, thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much. It's a really good question. And I think governance is absolutely critical. And that's why there's really an SDG on governance to be able to advance this. If you look in Asia, actually, you have a lot of really incredible success stories. Look at Korea, look at Singapore. These are countries that have had exponential growth rates over very, very short time frames. So it is possible. I think what you need to look there is at a combination, and governance is definitely underpins it. But it's, again, we don't have time to go into it, but it's really very illustrative to see what are the growth trajectories and the development trajectory of countries like South Korea or like Singapore, which were able to advance their economies and their growth patterns in really remarkable ways. And if you look at, for example, the G77, Singapore is a part of the G77, and its GDP is much higher than, for example, Bulgaria, that is a part of the European Union. So the answer is yes, but there's a whole host of issues that come around that. Right now, Bangladesh has been in the news very much. And if you look at the kind of policies that Bangladesh put in place, especially with manufacturing and how that has helped pull millions out of poverty. So there's many different ways. There's not a silver bullet. The answer is yes. What is really important is that you don't look at economic growth as economic growth. I go back to what I said. You can have a lot of economic growth. If you do that at the expense of social growth and social evolution and at the cost of the environment, that's not going to be sustainable. The World Bank does what they call total wealth accounting, where they're looking across the whole of it, all of the different types of wealth that there are in a country. And if you only look at the economic, you might end up with saying you have a really high GDP of whatever. When you start to factor in the social and particularly the environmental externalities, that growth can actually be negative. So never think of it as siloed economic. Think of it as integrated, because otherwise, at the end of the day, you're not going to be really growing. You are growing here at the expense of the future.
All right, I think we have time for one last question, and this one from Binta might be a good one to end on. Binta, are you able to read your question?
Yes, thank you so much, Mark, and thank you, Paula, for your wonderful presentation, and thank you so much for all the push you did to ensure that we have these SDGs today. So my name is Binta. I'm from Sierra Leone, West Africa, and I'm pursuing an MSc in Sustainable Development at University College Dublin. I just wanted to understand what your thoughts are on some of the main reasons for the world to be falling behind the SDGs, even after several member states have adopted them. And how do you think we can still achieve them, considering we're just like six years away from this? Thank you.
That's a brilliant question to end with, Binta. Thank you. So lots of thoughts. One, not a few countries, all countries adopted the SDGs unanimously at the UN General Assembly in 2015. So it was adopted by everybody. Secondly, I would reframe the question, because remember, there's no until 2030. As I say, this is really an agenda for 2050. And so it is very, I think in the UN, there's still short-sightedness in the sense that we're still looking at 2030. And then it inevitably raises the question, oh, should we renegotiate the SDGs? And there's a lot of people thinking already about how to renegotiate the SDGs, which, as I said, is absolutely impossible. And the main reason we're falling behind is because of inertia, incumbency. We want our comfort. And so we want to achieve the SDGs with the little gray armies. We have the water target and water goal, and then we have the water targets or the whatever. And we're sort of looking and measuring them separately. So you look at a target on land degradation, and that's an environment issue. It's not. It's a food security. It's an equity issue. It's an everything issue. It's a water issue. It is an energy issue, but you're looking at it very, very narrowly. And so we keep having these silo mentalities, and we keep trying to implement the SDGs, how we've always run development. And so when I'm asked, are we implementing the SDGs? My answer is no. I mean, we're implementing a bunch of separate targets, but that integrated vision, which is what the whole point of the SDGs are about, isn't there. And what we're going to do is exactly what happened with the COVID. Remember that when COVID happened, there was a green recovery and build back better and and all these richer countries and all countries were trying to look at to see how we could make the most of the crisis, and emissions were going down, and so we're going to change the emissions trajectory. That didn't last very long. Overnight, as soon as the crisis started to tamper down, emissions spiraled and everything, and we're right back where we started. The incumbency even for those who want to be transformative, who want to drive change, incumbency is incredible. We're so used to business as usual. I say to my team and to myself every day you have to grab yourself by the scuff of the neck and ask yourself if you are part of the problem or if you are truly trying to change things. And that's why we're not meeting the SDGs, because we keep trying to just implement them how we've always done development. And that's not going to deliver any change. Certainly not at the speed and scale that we need.
Well, we're out of time for today. Paula, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your story, for offering such inspiring vision and new ideas so that we can actually change the business as usual. I hope everybody takes it to heart.
Thank you for having me, Mark, and thank you all for these great questions. I wish we had more time because it's a really good conversation. So thank you so very much.
All right, everybody. We'll see you next week for Dr. Paul Walsh. We'll be sending out the weekly email tomorrow. Until then, have a happy local time and be well.